My own daughters called me an unfit grandfather, in writing, to a judge. 3 weeks earlier, all three of them let my 70th birthday pass without a single phone call. I sat alone that night with a slice of grocery store cake and a chessboard set for two, telling myself it was just a busy week, just bad timing, nothing more. Then a certified letter landed on my doorstep. Zero warning, zero explanation, just a court filing with my own daughter's names at the bottom, asking a judge to keep me away from my 8-year-old granddaughter for good. I stood in that doorway and read it 4 times before I understood what they'd actually done. What I didn't know yet was worse. They weren't protecting Sophie from me. They were protecting themselves from what I was about to find, hidden inside an account with my granddaughter's name on it. Welcome to Family Story Archives. Get comfortable. This one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Harold Whitfield. I spent 24 years as the principal of a high school in Richmond, Virginia. The kind of job where you learn to read a room before anyone says a word. I retired in 2019 with a pension, a handshake from the school board, and a wife named Eleanor, who used to say, I brought my hallway voice home with me. She wasn't wrong. 40 years of walking those tile floors does something to a man's posture and to the way he listens. I live alone now, in the same brick house on Magnolia Terrace I bought in 1987, back when the streets still had more dirt than pavement. I drive a navy blue Buick LeSabre 2006 model, and I change the oil myself every 5,000 miles because Eleanor used to tease me about paying a mechanic to do a 10-minute job. Every Saturday morning, I sit on the porch with a chessboard and play both sides, slow, deliberate, the way I used to review discipline files before a parent meeting. I keep a leather notebook, the same habit from my working days. I write things down, dates, numbers, what was said, and by who. It's not paranoia. It's just how my mind has always worked. Eleanor died in March of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral, fast enough that none of us fully processed it before it was already over. She used to sit on that same porch with me on Saturday mornings, not playing chess herself. She never had the patience for it, but reading with her feet propped up on the railing, and the porch has felt a size too big ever since she stopped filling that chair. After she passed, something in my daughter shifted. Though it took me almost 3 years to fully understand, it wasn't grief in the ordinary sense. It was distance, and it was deliberate, even if none of them would have called it that at the time, and each of them found her own way to build it, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, until the wall between us was tall enough that I stopped being able to see clearly what was happening on the other side of it. Denise is 45, a real estate attorney out in Short Pump. Always got a closing, always got a deadline, always got a reason. Marla is 42, works night shifts as a nurse at Bon Secours, genuinely exhausted most of the time, the kind of tired that makes a person forget things without meaning any harm by it. And Tanya, my youngest at 38, doesn't work, hasn't in years, lives off what her husband brings in and what, as it turned out, she'd been quietly taking from somewhere else. I have one granddaughter, Sophie, 8 years old, Tanya's daughter, 3rd grade at Ginter Park Elementary. Sophie has Eleanor's laugh, the kind that starts before the joke's even finished. For the first 6 years of her life, I saw her every week. Sunday dinners, chess lessons she pretended to hate and secretly loved. Then, about 14 months before my birthday, the visits started drying up. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part that took me the longest to see clearly. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. It started small, the way most of these things do. A canceled Sunday dinner in September, Denise texting that she had a client emergency at 4 in the afternoon, an hour before she was supposed to walk through my door. Fine. Then Marla forgetting my birthday card in the mail for 2 weeks, then 3 until it just never came at all. Fine. Then in October, I called Tanya to ask if I could pick Sophie up from school on a Friday, something I'd done a dozen times before, ever since she was in kindergarten, and Tanya said she'd check with her husband and call me back. She never called back. I remember standing in my kitchen on a Sunday in late October, the one Sunday dinner that fall that actually happened, all three daughters and Sophie crowded around my table the way it used to be most weeks when Eleanor was alive. Tanya barely said 10 words the entire meal. Denise kept checking her phone under the table, thinking I didn't notice. And when I asked Sophie, casually, what she wanted for her birthday coming up in the spring, Tanya answered for her, fast, before Sophie could even open her mouth. "We'll figure that out closer to the date, Dad." Something in the way she said it stuck with me longer than it should have. A closed door dressed up as a postponement. By November, the calls I made started going straight to voicemail. Not immediately. I'd hear one ring, sometimes two, before it cut off, the specific sound of someone declining rather than missing. I wrote it down in the notebook. November 14th, called Tanya, 3:02 in the afternoon, declined after one ring. November 21st, called Denise, no answer, no call back by the following Monday. December 2nd, drove by Marla's house on a Saturday. Her car was in the driveway. Nobody answered the door. In early December, before I'd stop making excuses for the silence, I drove over to Tanya's townhouse unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, something I almost never did. But Sophie's birthday was coming up in a few weeks, and I wanted to ask what she might like. Tanya answered the door only part way, blocking the frame with her body in a way that felt deliberate, and Sophie's voice called out from somewhere behind her, asking who it was before Tanya cut her off fast. "It's nobody, baby. Go finish your homework." "Tanya, I just wanted to ask about Sophie's birthday." "Dad, now's not a good time." Her eyes wouldn't hold mine, flicking instead somewhere past my shoulder toward the street, like she was checking whether a neighbor might be watching. "Actually, you know what? I think it's better if you don't come by unannounced anymore. You don't get to see her until you stop asking so many questions, okay? Just stop asking where things went. Stop asking about everything. It's exhausting." I stood on that step a long moment after she shut the door, turning the sentence over. Stop asking where things went. At the time I read it as ordinary daughterly exhaustion, the kind that comes from juggling a marriage and a kid and a father grieving louder than he realized. It would be almost 2 months before I understood I'd been standing on that porch listening to a confession and hadn't recognized it as one. I told myself I was imagining a pattern. Grief does that, makes a man see conspiracies in silence. So I let it go, mostly, until my birthday came in January and not one of my 3 daughters called, texted, or showed up. I sat on my porch that evening with a piece of cake from the Kroger on Forest Hill and a chessboard set for 2, and I played both sides, same as always, and I told myself it didn't hurt as much as it did. Around 8 that night, I sent a message to Sophie's tablet, the one Tanya let her use for video calls, just to say goodnight and happy birthday to myself in the same breath. It sat there unread until the next morning, and even then, no reply came back. 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday, a certified letter arrived at my door. I remember the date because I wrote it down before I even opened the envelope, out of habit. January 28th. Inside was a filing from the Richmond Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. A petition, filed jointly by all 3 of my daughters, requesting a formal restriction on grandparent visitation. The word they used was concerning. My behavior around Sophie had become concerning. There were no specifics, just that word, sitting on the page like it belonged there. I read it 4 times standing in my own doorway before I understood what I was holding. I had not seen Sophie in 6 weeks by that point. I had not raised my voice at any of my daughters in longer than that. I had not done anything, as far as I could tell, except grow old alone in a house that used to be full of people. And now 3 women who shared my blood were telling a judge I was a danger to a child I used to walk to the school bus stop every morning of 1st grade. I called Denise first because she was the lawyer, because some part of me still believed she'd explain it away as a misunderstanding. She picked up on the fourth ring. Dad, I can't really talk right now. You filed papers against me, Denise. I think you can talk right now. There was a pause, the kind where I could hear her deciding how much to say. It's not against you. It's for Sophie. There's been some concerns raised. By who? Raised by who? I really can't get into it over the phone. You're my daughter. You're going to have to get into it somehow. She hung up. Not slammed the phone down. Nothing dramatic. Just the soft click of someone choosing to end a conversation before it went somewhere she didn't want it to go. I sat with the dial tone in my ear for a long moment before I set the receiver down. That night I called Ruth Okafor. Ruth's lived 2 doors down from me for going on 30 years, ever since her and her late husband moved in when the neighborhood was still mostly young families. She spent 31 years as an accountant before she retired, sharp as anyone I've ever known. And she's the only person left in Richmond who still calls me most mornings just to talk, mostly about the news, sometimes about nothing at all. They filed what? She said when I told her, and I could hear her setting a coffee mug down hard enough that it clinked against something. A restriction, calling me concerning. Concerning how? That's the thing, Ruth. It doesn't say. She was quiet for a second, the kind of quiet I'd come to recognize from 30 years of knowing her. The sound of her mentally flipping through a ledger. Harold, has anybody said anything to you about money? About Sophie's accounts? Anything like that? I hadn't thought about the fund in months. When Sophie was born, I'd opened a custodial education account for her, the kind meant to sit and grow untouched until she needed it for school, the same way I'd done for all 3 of my own daughters back when they were young. I put in a lump sum at the start and smaller deposits every few months since, nothing extravagant, just steady, the way Eleanor and I always tried to do things. $26,000, give or take, last I checked, which admittedly had been close to a year. Why do you ask that? Because 2 months ago, I saw Tanya at the CVS on Forest Hill, standing at the register looking like she hadn't slept in a week, and when I asked how things were going, she said something about a rough patch with money and changed the subject fast. I didn't think much of it at the time. People go through rough patches. But now you're telling me they're filing court papers calling you concerning out of nowhere with no specifics attached. And I don't know, Harold. Something about the timing doesn't sit right with me. You think it's connected. I think you've spent your whole life noticing patterns other people walk right past. I'd start by checking that account if I were you. Tonight, if you can't sleep anyway. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the leather notebook open and a legal pad next to it, and I started writing down everything I could remember. Every canceled visit, every declined call, every excuse. By the time the sun came up, I had 3 pages, and I had one glaring gap I couldn't fill. I hadn't checked Sophie's account in 11 months. The bank that held Sophie's custodial account was a regional credit union on Forest Hill Avenue, the same branch I'd used for almost every account I'd ever opened since 1979. As the custodian on the account, I still had legal access, something none of my daughters seemed to remember, or maybe they simply assumed a 70-year-old man wouldn't think to check. I drove over that Wednesday morning, 9 sharp when the doors opened, and asked for a printed statement history. 12 months, every transaction, down to the cent. The woman behind the counter, a young manager named Priya, no relation to the school nurse I'd meet later, though the coincidence in names would strike me weeks after, took my identification, typed for a while, and came back looking a little more careful than she had going in. She printed 6 pages and slid them across the counter without a word, the kind of silence that told me she'd already glanced at the numbers herself. I sat in the Buick in the parking lot and read every line twice. The first withdrawal was for $400, dated 14 months earlier, right around the time the visits started thinning out. Then another, $600, 3 weeks later. Then a gap of 2 months. Quiet, almost like whoever was doing this had gotten scared and stopped. Then 3 withdrawals in a single week that fall, each one just under $1,000, the kind of amount that looks deliberate to anyone who's ever reviewed a budget line by line, small enough to avoid a second signature requirement the credit union had on larger transfers. Whoever did this understood exactly where the line sat and stayed just under it every single time. By the time I reached the last page, the account that had held $26,118 11 months earlier now held $1,412. Every withdrawal traced back to the same authorized user code. Tanya. I sat in that parking lot for close to an hour, engine off, both hands still on the wheel like I was driving somewhere. Not angry yet, not really. More like a man standing at the edge of a hole trying to gauge how deep it went before he started climbing down into it. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else that day. What kept circling back through my mind wasn't the money, it was the timing. 14 months of withdrawals lined up almost exactly with 14 months of my daughters going quiet, and I couldn't yet tell if that was cause or cover or both at once. I called Gerald Finch that afternoon. Gerald had been a student of mine at Jefferson Davis Heights back before they renamed it Huguenot High. A quiet kid who used to eat lunch alone in the library until I put him on the debate team because I figured a boy who read that much ought to learn how to argue out loud. He'd gone on to become a family law attorney, 31 years in practice now, office on Grove Avenue with his own name on the door, and he still called me Mr. Whitfield every time we spoke, even though I'd told him a dozen times he didn't have to. Mr. Whitfield, it's been a while. I need your help, Gerald, and I need you to be straight with me, not gentle. I told him everything, start to finish, the petition, the bank statements sitting on my kitchen table, the 14 months of silence that had led up to it. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and I could hear him writing something down, the scratch of a pen against paper, an old habit from a man I'd trained to take good notes 40 years ago without either of us realizing it at the time. First thing, he said, the petition they filed, the concerning language, that's vague on purpose. Courts see that kind of filing all the time. Usually it's either genuine or it's a preemptive move, meaning somebody's trying to get ahead of a conversation before it happens. Given what you're telling me about the account, I'd guess preemptive. Meaning if Tanya's been pulling money from Sophie's custodial account without authorization and she's worried you're about to find out. One way to protect herself is to discredit you first. If a judge already has a filing on record calling you concerning, and then you come forward with allegations against her, it looks like retaliation instead of discovery. Muddies the water in her favor. I sat with that for a while, the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the 6 pages of statements spread out in front of me. She used her own daughter as a shield. I'd want more before I said that for certain, Mr. Whitfield. But it's a pattern I've seen before. Ugly one. And I've seen it more than once in 31 years. Gerald asked me to bring him everything. The bank statements, the notebook, dates of every declined call, every canceled visit, anything at all that could show a timeline. He said we needed a paper trail thicker than whatever thin justification was behind their petition, and he said it gently, but he also said something else I wrote down word for word because it stuck with me. He said, Mr. Whitfield, courts don't care about hurt feelings. They care about documentation. Give me documentation and give me all of it, even the parts that feel small. I spent the next 9 days building it, and those 9 days taught me things I hadn't expected to learn about my own family. On the second day, I drove out to Ruth's house with the leather notebook and asked her to help me organize the timeline properly, month by month, the way she used to build audit trails back when she was still working. She spread everything across her dining room table and started color-coding entries with sticky notes, blue for withdrawals, yellow for canceled visits, and by the time we were done, the pattern on that table was impossible to argue with. Every color cluster lined up almost exactly. You know what this looks like, Ruth said, sitting back in her chair. Tell me. It looks like somebody needed you far away before you had a chance to look too closely. And it worked. For 14 months, it worked. There was still a piece missing, though, and both of us knew it. The bank statements showed money leaving. They didn't show where it was going, and Gerald had been clear that motive, while not strictly required, would matter to a judge trying to decide whether this was malice or desperation. On the 7th day, Ruth made an offer I tried twice to turn down. I know a man, does background work, used to do it for the firm I worked at back in the 90s. $1,200, cash. And he can tell you within a week whether there's a pattern with Dale worth knowing about. Ruth, I can't ask you to pay for that. You didn't ask. I'm offering. And Harold, I've watched you carry every single thing in this family by yourself since Eleanor passed. The funeral costs, the lawyer for Denise's first house closing that went sideways, all of it quietly. Never once asking anybody for help back. Let somebody carry something for you for once. I took the money, uncomfortable the whole drive to hand it over, and 8 days later, the investigator's report landed in my inbox. Dele Reyes had 3 active accounts on offshore sports betting platforms, cumulative losses over the past 22 months totaling just over $31,000, and a second mortgage taken out on their townhouse the previous spring that Tanya's name was on, but, according to the report, she may not have fully understood the terms of at the time she signed. It didn't excuse what Tanya had done, but it explained the desperation underneath it in a way that made the whole picture sharper and sadder all at once. I want to slow down here because I think it matters who these women really were, not just what they did, because none of them were simple villains, and understanding that made everything harder, not easier. Denise was the one who called it a closing. Every excuse she gave had the shape of professionalism, tidy and reasonable sounding, and I think for a long time she believed her own excuses more than I did. She wasn't cruel. She was avoidant. The kind of avoidant that comes from watching your mother die slowly over 11 weeks and deciding the only way to survive it is to never let yourself feel anything that big again. She hadn't spoken more than 10 unscripted minutes to me since the funeral. Even at Eleanor's service, she'd stood at the back near the door the whole time, close enough to leave quickly if she needed to. I noticed that then and didn't understand it. I understood it better now. Marla was different. Marla forgot things because she was genuinely drowning. Back-to-back night shifts at Bon Secours. A husband who worked just as much. 2 kids of her own she barely saw awake most weeks. When I finally reached her by phone that second week after the petition arrived, she started crying almost immediately before I'd even finished a sentence. "Dad, I didn't know about any of it. I swear to you, I didn't know." "Know about what, Marla? Say it." "About the account, about what Tanya was doing." Denise told me it was just about, I don't know, general concerns. That's the word she used. And I signed it because she's my sister and I trusted her. I didn't ask enough questions. I know that now. I believed her. Not immediately, but eventually, because Marla had never been a planner, never been the kind of person who thought 3 steps ahead about anything, not even her own grocery list most weeks. She'd signed the petition because Tanya asked her to, and because Denise said it was probably fine, and because she was too tired most days to ask a single follow-up question about anything, work included. Tanya was the one I needed to understand least and understood most in the end. She'd married a man named Dale 4 years earlier. Quiet wedding at a courthouse, no big ceremony, which should have told me something even then. Dale had a habit I hadn't known about until Ruth mentioned it in passing one evening on her porch, an online gambling habit that had quietly eaten through most of their savings over the past 2 years, sports betting apps mostly, the kind that send a notification every time there's a game on. Tanya hadn't been stealing from Sophie out of malice. She'd been drowning too, in a different way, watching her marriage slide toward collapse one missed mortgage payment at a time and grabbing at whatever was closest to keep it afloat. And the account with Sophie's name on it had been closest and quietest and easiest to convince herself she'd pay back before anyone noticed. None of that made it right. I want to be clear about that. Taking from your own child's future to cover somebody else's mistake is still taking, no matter how sympathetic the reason behind it looks from the outside. But it changed what kind of story I was standing inside of. This wasn't 3 women plotting against an old man out of greed. This was 3 women each running from something, and somewhere in that running, they'd all decided the easiest thing to sacrifice was me. On the 3rd day, sitting at my kitchen table past midnight with the statement spread out under the lamp, I found myself thinking back further than I had in years, to a job I hadn't talked about with anyone since before Denise was born. Before I ever stood in front of a classroom, I spent 6 years as a fraud investigator for the Virginia Department of Education, tracing misused funds through school districts across the state. Mostly small stuff. An athletic budget padded here. A textbook order inflated there, but sometimes something bigger. I remembered a superintendent outside Lynchburg who'd been skimming from a special education fund for almost 3 years before anyone caught it. And I remembered how he'd done it exactly the way whoever was pulling from Sophie's account had done it. Small amounts, just under whatever threshold triggered a second signature. Patient, confident, nobody was watching closely enough to notice. I'd left that job in 1979 to take the assistant principal position at Jefferson Davis Heights, partly because Eleanor wanted to start a family and the school hours were steadier, partly because chasing paper trails for a living had started to wear on me in a way I couldn't fully explain at the time. I told people for years afterward that I'd simply moved on to something different. I never told them the skill never actually left. It just went quiet, waiting, the way a muscle waits even after you stop using it on purpose. On day 6 of my 9 days of gathering evidence, I got a call from a woman named Priya Anand, the school nurse at Ginter Park Elementary, not the bank manager, a different Priya entirely, though I'd think about that coincidence more than once in the weeks that followed. She said Sophie had come to her office that Tuesday upset, and that the reason had come out slowly. The way things do with an 8-year-old who doesn't fully understand what she's saying is significant. Sophie had been left off the list for a class field trip to the Science Museum, the whole 3rd grade filing onto a yellow bus that Thursday morning while she sat at a spare desk in the front office doing worksheets instead, watching through the window as her classmates climbed aboard. When she'd asked her teacher why quietly, the way an 8-year-old asks something she already suspects is embarrassing, the teacher had gently explained that her field trip fee hadn't been paid, $340 due back in September, still outstanding 2 months later. She told me her mom said the money was for a special account and it would come out of that, Priya said. She specifically said Grandpa's account, and she said it kind of proudly, actually, like she thought that made it sound better instead of worse. I wasn't sure who to call. It's not really the kind of thing that fits neatly into a report, but something about the way she said it, I don't know. It felt like I should tell somebody, and you were the only name I could think to try. I thanked her more than once, and after I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while just picturing it, Sophie at that spare desk with a worksheet in front of her, watching a bus pull away without her on it for the sake of $340 that should have been sitting untouched in an account meant to carry her all the way to college. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair after that call. $340. A field trip to a science museum. And the account meant to protect that little girl's future sat with $1,400 left in it because somebody needed cash faster than the truth could catch up. By day 9, Gerald had what he called an airtight file, 12 months of bank statements. My notebook, dated and specific, a signed statement from Ruth about the CVS conversation, and, with the school's cooperation, a documented account from Priya Anand about the field trip conversation, given carefully, without leading Sophie toward any particular answer. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late February, 6 weeks after the petition was filed. I remember the exact date because I wrote it in the notebook the moment Gerald's office called with it. February 26th, 9:45 in the morning, Richmond Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court, Room 3B. I want to say I walked into that courtroom feeling powerful, but that's not honest. I walked in feeling like a man about to watch 3 parts of his family come apart in public, no matter what the outcome was. Gerald sat beside me at the table, calm the way he'd always been calm as a kid arguing about zoning law on the debate team, a thick manila folder squared neatly in front of him. On the other side of the room sat my 3 daughters, and beside them, a lawyer I didn't recognize, a younger man who kept glancing at his phone even after the bailiff asked everyone to silence them. Tanya wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere on the table's wood grain, her hands folded so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Denise looked at me exactly once, a flat, unreadable glance, then back down at the folder in front of her own lawyer. Her jaw set the way it used to set when she was a teenager bracing for an argument she didn't want to have. Marla looked like she hadn't slept in a week, which, knowing her shifts, she probably hadn't. And when our eyes met briefly across the room, she looked away first. ashamed in a way that felt different from her sister's. The bailiff called the room to order at 9:47, 2 minutes behind schedule. Judge Alvarez took her seat and reviewed the file in front of her for a long, silent minute before speaking, the kind of silence that makes a courtroom feel twice its actual size. The judge, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, opened by reviewing the original petition, the language about concerning behavior, and asked counsel for the petitioners, meaning my daughters, to specify the concerns for the record. There was a long pause. The young lawyer shuffled some papers. Your Honor, the family has expressed general concerns about Mr. Whitfield's judgment and stability following the loss of his wife. Judge Alvarez looked unimpressed. General concerns aren't a basis for restricting a grandparent's access to a minor child counselor. I need specifics, or I need to understand why none exist. That was the tension point, the moment where the room seemed to hold its breath. Because up until then, my daughters believed the vagueness would protect them. It didn't. Gerald stood. Your Honor, if I may, we'd like to submit evidence that speaks directly to why this petition may have been filed, and I think it will clarify the general concerns significantly. What followed took maybe 20 minutes, though it felt much longer sitting there. Gerald walked the judge through the bank statements month by month. The pattern of withdrawals that started right when Sophie's visits with me began drying up. He introduced Ruth's statement about the conversation at the CVS. He introduced, carefully and without dramatics, the account from the school nurse about the field trip fee and what Sophie had said about Grandpa's account. I watched Tanya's face while Gerald spoke. She went pale first, then very still, the stillness of someone doing math in their head and not liking any of the numbers. Denise had her hand pressed flat against the table, and I realized watching her that she likely hadn't known the full extent of it either, only enough to go along with a story that made sense at the time it was told to her. The judge asked Tanya directly whether she had authorized withdrawals from the custodial account without her father's knowledge. There was a long silence in that courtroom, long enough that I heard the air conditioning cycle on somewhere above us, long enough that I watched the young lawyer beside Tanya lean over and whisper something she didn't respond to. Mrs. Reyes, Judge Alvarez said again, more evenly this time. I need an answer for the record. Yes, Tanya finally said. Her voice was small in a way I hadn't heard since she was maybe 12 years old, standing in a school hallway after getting caught in some minor teenage lie. I was going to pay it back. I always meant to pay it back. And the petition your family filed against your father, restricting his access to your daughter, was that filed in any part to delay him discovering these withdrawals? Another silence, longer than the first. Denise shifted in her seat beside her sister. Marla had both hands pressed over her mouth. I don't know, Tanya said finally, and it was the first honest thing I'd heard her say in 14 months. I think maybe it was. I don't think I let myself think about it that clearly until right now. I didn't say anything. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. Not in that room. Not in front of a judge. Not in front of Sophie's future being weighed out loud by strangers. I sat there with my hands folded on the table the way I used to sit through the hardest parent conferences of my career, and I let the silence do what silence does better than anger ever could. Judge Alvarez didn't raise her voice either. She simply said that the court would be denying the petition for visitation restriction, that the matter of the custodial account would be referred separately for review given its potential criminal implications regarding misappropriation of a minor's trust funds, and that she strongly recommended the family pursue mediation before this reached her courtroom again in any form. Then she looked directly at me, the first time she had since the hearing began. Mr. Whitfield, is there anything you'd like to say for the record? I thought about that leather notebook sitting in my bag. 40 years of writing things down, watching, waiting, never acting until I had enough to act on. I thought about all the versions of myself people had underestimated over the years, the quiet hallway principal nobody thought had much fire in him. Only that I spent 24 years keeping a school running, Your Honor. Discipline files, budget reviews, teachers who thought nobody was watching the numbers closely enough. I suppose some habits don't retire when you do. I kept the records running instead. I don't know why that line landed the way it did in that room. Maybe because it wasn't dramatic. Maybe because everyone in that room, including my daughters, understood exactly what I meant without me having to spell it out further. Court adjourned a few minutes later. Judge Alvarez's ruling entered into the record exactly as she'd stated it. The petition denied, the account matter referred for review, mediation recommended before anything like this returned to her courtroom. I stood in the hallway outside room 3B afterward, Gerald beside me gathering papers back into his folder, and Marla was the first one to come find me, walking fast like she'd been holding herself back the entire hearing just to get through it. She didn't say much at first, just wrapped her arms around me the way she used to when she was small enough that I could pick her straight up off the ground and spin her in the backyard. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked closer instead of just signing whatever Denise put in front of me." "You believe me now?" "I believed you before. I just didn't want to be the one who said it out loud because saying it out loud meant admitting what Tanya might have actually done. And I think some part of me didn't want that to be true about my own sister." "It's over now, Marla, the believing part anyway." "Is it, though?" "Over, I mean." She looked past me down the hallway toward where Tanya was still sitting on a bench alone, her lawyer already gone, staring at the floor tiles like they might rearrange themselves into an answer. "No," I told her honestly, "but it started. That's different, and it's enough for today." 2 weeks later, on the first Sunday in March, all three of my daughters came to dinner together for the first time in over a year, though it wasn't the easy, noisy table it used to be when Eleanor was alive. Tanya sat quiet most of the meal, and Denise kept glancing at her sister with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between resentment and worry that hadn't sorted itself out yet. But Sophie sat between Marla and me, telling a long meandering story about a substitute teacher who'd let the class watch a documentary about octopuses, gesturing with both hands to demonstrate how many arms one had lost and regrown, insisting this was the most important fact she'd learned all year, and for 20 minutes at least, the table sounded almost like it used to back when Eleanor was the one keeping everybody laughing at once. The following weeks looked different than I expected. Not clean, not a movie ending, more like the slow, uneven work of putting something back together that had genuinely broken. Marla started coming by most Sundays again, bringing her own 2 kids sometimes, and she was the one who arranged for Sophie to visit that first weekend after the hearing, standing at my door with Sophie's hand in hers, saying nothing, just letting the 2 of us have that moment back. Denise called me 2 weeks after the hearing, and I could tell it had taken her that long to work up to it. The way she used to sit outside my old office as a teenager, building up the nerve to admit something before ever walking through the door. She didn't apologize the way Marla had, in a flood all at once. Denise apologizes the way she does everything, quietly and through action rather than words. She told me she'd contacted Gerald's office directly and covered the full cost of my legal fees, all of it, without being asked, and asked that I not mention it to her sisters. I kept that promise until now, though I suspect she won't mind me finally saying it. Months later, in June, she started showing up to Sunday dinner again on her own. No excuses. No phone checking under the table. Just there. Same as she used to be before Eleanor got sick. Tanya's road was longer, and it isn't finished. The court referred the custodial account matter for review, and rather than push for the harshest outcome available to me, I worked with Gerald and the bank to set up a structured repayment plan instead, monthly, modest, enough that she could actually manage it without it destroying what was left of her marriage or her ability to parent Sophie. Dale moved out 3 months after the hearing. I don't know the full story there, and I didn't ask for it, though Ruth heard through the neighborhood that the gambling debts had finally caught up with more than just Sophie's account. Tanya still struggles some days. She showed up crying on my porch one evening in April. No warning, just standing there in the porch light looking like she hadn't slept. And I made coffee, and we sat there mostly in silence. And it wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was a start. The kind you build one Tuesday at a time, rather than all in one conversation. "I keep thinking about what you said in that courtroom," she told me that night, staring down into a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking from, steam long gone, her hands wrapped around it anyway like it still had something to offer her. "About keeping the records running." It wasn't really about the records, Tanya. I know what it was about. She looked up at me then, the first time she'd held my eyes in almost a year. I'm sorry, Dad. Not the kind of sorry you say to make something go away. The other kind. I didn't have a clean answer for her that night, and I didn't try to manufacture one. Some things take longer than a single porch conversation to repair, and I've learned enough in 70 years to know that rushing an apology toward forgiveness usually cheapens both. A week after the hearing, I called Sophie's teacher directly, a young woman named Miss Castellano who'd been nothing but kind through the whole ordeal, and asked whether it would be appropriate for me to take Sophie to the Science Museum myself privately, since she'd missed the class trip in the fall. Miss Castellano said she thought that would mean a great deal to Sophie, and mentioned gently that Sophie had asked more than once in class why she hadn't gotten to go with everyone else, never quite understanding the real reason behind it, only that something about money and grown-up problems had gotten in the way. Sophie got her science museum trip eventually, though she missed the class one back in the fall. I drove her myself on a Saturday in March, just the two of us in the Buick, windows cracked because she likes the sound of the highway, and she spent 40 minutes at the planetarium exhibit asking me questions I mostly didn't know the answers to. How far away is that star really? Why does the moon follow the car? Whether Grandma could see us from wherever she was now. I didn't have good answers for most of it, but I gave her the honest ones I had, and I wrote down every question in the leather notebook that night, because some habits really don't retire. Not the useful ones anyway. Gerald called me in May, mostly just to check in, though I suspect he also wanted to see how the family was settling after everything. I asked him, half joking, whether he'd ever expected the quiet kid from the debate team to end up defending his old principal in family court 30 years later. Honestly, Mr. Whitfield, no. But I'll tell you what I did expect. I always figured if anybody in this town knew how to build an airtight case out of nothing but patience and a notebook, it'd be you. You used to catch kids cheating on tests just by noticing which ones suddenly started sitting up straighter. Different kind of cheating this time. Same instinct though. You just watch, and you wait, and you write it down until the truth runs out of places to hide. I thought about that a long time after we hung up, how much of who I turned out to be, both as a principal and as whatever this year had made of me, had never really been about authority at all. It was always about paying close enough attention that people eventually told on themselves, whether they meant to or not. Priya Anand, the school nurse, sent me a short note that spring, not required of her, just something she wanted to say. She wrote that she'd worried for weeks after that first conversation with Sophie whether she'd done the right thing getting involved, whether it was overstepping to call a stranger about a comment an 8-year-old made in passing. I wrote back and told her that one phone call from a person willing to notice something small had mattered more than she'd probably ever know, and that Sophie was doing just fine now, thanks in no small part to a school nurse who paid closer attention than most people bother to. I still play chess on my porch most Saturday mornings. Sophie's started joining me some weekends now, sitting cross-legged in the chair Eleanor used to use, and she's better than she lets on. The same quiet trick her grandmother used to pull on me for 30 years before I ever caught on. Last Saturday, she beat me in 11 moves and tried very hard not to smile about it. And when I asked where she learned that particular opening, she just shrugged and said Grandma taught her in a dream, which I didn't argue with because some things a man learns not to argue with after 70 years. A few nights ago, I sat down and reread that old notebook entry from January, the one where I wrote that nobody called on my birthday, that I ate cake alone and played chess against myself on an empty porch. Underneath it, more recently, in ink that hadn't faded yet, I'd added a new line. Sophie called today just to talk. No occasion, just wanted to hear my voice. Eleanor used to tell me that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs somebody patient enough to write it down and wait for the right moment to read it back. I spent 24 years keeping a school running on exactly that principle, watching quietly, writing things down, trusting that patience would eventually tell me more than confrontation ever could. It turns out the habit serves a man just as well at home as it ever did in a hallway full of teenagers who thought nobody was paying attention. Some things you don't retire from. You just wait for the moment they're needed again. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Family Story Archives. I will see you on the next one.